What's up, everyone? Welcome to Moments with the Marcelins. My name is Jun.
And my name is Stephanie.
We are so excited because the holidays are near. I'm ready to eat. I'm ready to stuff my face. I'm ready to break every diet plan that I have going on so I can eat all the food that I want and be happy. What are you most excited for the holidays?
Most excited about, I think, is decorating. I like that nesting and giving it like the vibe for the year. I think just seeing it kind of uplifts me a little bit. So I did it early this year. I was the one who put a Christmas tree out and I own it.
You had a little help now.
Yes, Kobe helped. I'm just kidding. No,
wow.
My husband did help. You did a great job. Thank you, babe. Obviously, I couldn't do it without you. Everything was in storage in boxes. So no, but it was good. I like to see, everything just kind of out there and Christmas cheer. I'm here for it.
I'm usually not the most, Christmas spirited when it comes to the decor and things like that. But I think 2020 has hit us so hard. It's like, yes, let's bring out the tree. Yes. Let's decorate.
Yes.
I don't care. I was ready to put that thing up in July, but that's what kind of year this has been. But, God is good. God is faithful through it all.
Yes, he's brought us until this point, until this moment. And, just continue to be safe and pray for all those affected. And do some self-care. So I feel like that was a self-care moment for me when I put it up. It made me feel better.
So what are we talking about today?
So today we're talking about the expectation of education. And so we had the honor and privilege to actually interview Dr. Nicole Baker-Fulgham for this episode.
This was really a great conversation. I know I probably say that every episode, but our conversation with Dr. Nicole was such an insightful one. Yeah. And my hope is that every listener, particularly all of our educators, our teachers, if you're in the school system, you can probably identify with the content that is that you're about to hear. And so we really had a great time.
I think that we're all impacted by education in one way, shape, or form. We all went to public school. Maybe the majority of us went to public school. We all had experiences and different communities that we lived in and how that impacted our education and even moving forward, whether it's, you and your kids or your grandkids or, future kids. So I really brought me to the moment of realization that, this is something that we need to talk about, we need to change, we need to be educated on, and what is my part to play in that. Dr. Nicole Baker-Fulgham is the president and founder of the Expectations Project, which is the nation's largest network of faith-motivated education equity advocates. Originally from Detroit, Nicole taught fifth grade in Compton, California, after graduating from the University of Michigan. She earned her doctorate in education at the University of California in LA, really focusing on urban education policy. She then joined the National Staff of Teachers in America as the Vice President of Teacher Preparation and Support, where she was responsible for training and supporting 4,500 teachers annually. She then founded Teachers for America Faith Communities Initiative before launching the Expectations Project. Nicole speaks regularly at faith-based and education conferences and was named to Christianity Today's list of 50 Christian women influencing the church and culture. Nicole is also an author of 2 books. First is Educating All God's Children, What Christians Can Do to Improve Low-Income Public Schools for Kids. And the second one, Schools in Crisis. This woman is powerful. She is
in short,
amazing.
She's a boss.
She's a boss woman. She's amazing. But overall, she is a believer and she practices what she preaches. And I love that. And so tune in to our interview today. So, Dr. Nicole, can you give us a little bit of background on yourself and the work that you do?
Sure. So I am originally from Detroit, Michigan. Grew up in a working class neighborhood there. And, both of my parents were first generation college students. So they both had a college education. My mother majored in early childhood education. So she had very strong opinions about what my brother and I did before we went to kindergarten. And so education was always an important part of what they focused on for both of us. And they really saw it as it was for them, just an opportunity to have additional things in front of us in terms of choices, potential income, impact on the world. And our neighborhood, though, over time in Detroit really faced a lot of economic decline. And so it went from more of a working class, maybe some middle class families, to definitely all working class, and many families in poverty. And so during that time, the school system follows, the economic trends, unfortunately, of most cities. And amazing teachers in our neighborhood public schools, every family wanted the best for their kids, but the schools were really struggling. So my brother and I, by the time we went to high school, both got accepted into an exam public high school in Detroit, which is what it sounds like. You take a test to get in, and they kind of, for lack of a better word, they sort of cream the top academic kids off the top, and give them this very extraordinary public school experience in Detroit. AP classes and everything, 99% of us went on to four-year colleges, Ivy Leagues, the best state schools in Michigan, sort of the whole nine. And I think the differentiator for me that I saw then was the expectations, which is why I named my organization what I did. But it was literally the expectations that we got at that school. People assumed we were smart. They assumed we were worthy of going to college and would go. And from day one, that's all they talked about. My friends who didn't get into that school, and it was very small, very few kids in Detroit got in. All of my friends on my block went to our neighborhood high school, and they got something very different. About half of them didn't graduate. There were no AP classes. My friends, many of them had no one mention college to them for 4 years. Wow. And, as a kid growing up, you start to see the disparity between what you got and what your friends got. And then I could also compare the disparities between what my very good public high school in Detroit got compared to the very wealthy suburban public and private schools. And that was kind of another level of disparity. And so for me, combining that with growing up in the Black church, we went to a church that really emphasized putting your faith in action. Every week, our pastor had some connection to, some social issue in the city, and he organized protests, and it was a very influential church. So he frequently would, have elected officials kind of, come and get their comeuppance in front of the congregation about the things they said they were going to do that they hadn't done yet. And so all of that for me made me see, one, inequality is real for kids and for schools. But two, as a Christian, I felt I had a responsibility to do something about it. So I went and joined Teach for America and taught in Compton, California, and ended up getting my PhD in education policy because that's what I was interested in the most.
Can you share in depth the tale of two public school systems and its origins?
Yeah. I mean, I think it circles back to some of the things I was sharing, but, we have a long history in this country of ultimately setting up a school system that is only designed to educate some people, right? I mean, that was the history of America, quite frankly. Way back when you could only go to school if you were a man, a boy, and if your family had owned property, you were wealthy, right? And then we sort of opened it up to everybody, except it was for a while just boys, and then boys and girls, and then white boys and girls, right? And so on and so on. And the rest of us, Black, brown, immigrant, other, had to continue to fight for even having access to a free public education, let alone a quality one, right? Jim Crow, I mean, we can go down the list there. So I think that's really where the origins of that have begun. We can look at the contemporary issues and the fact that we see, kids in low-income communities are, significantly less likely to graduate from high school and go to college. So that seems like a right now issue, but the roots of that issue, the two public school systems, were formed from the beginning of this country. And from my perspective, honestly, it stems back to, what do we really believe about every single child? Do we really believe every single child can achieve, should have the opportunity to achieve? Because if we did, we would have a different system that was giving different outcomes. And we're just not there yet. So I question even our core belief as a country as to whether or not that's necessary or we want that for everybody.
That's so true. And I see it. Like, I grew up in Miami, Florida, and you're, you know what I mean? And the books that we had, the resources, the classes that we had, there wasn't many, and it wasn't until my parents, as Latinos, my parents wanted to move me to a different district, right?
Yeah.
Because they wanted better schools. And you see that so often. It's like, I don't want to live in this in this district anymore, in this county, because there's not that many resources for you. I need to move you to a better area, the suburbs. That way you have a more promising future. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it's crazy that, families have to do this all across the nation.
Yeah, it is. And you bring up a good point. We talk a lot about the outcomes that kids have, like what percent go on to college or graduate from high school. But like, it really starts at the resources that we give each school district, and so you're mentioning not having books and resources. And we can't possibly expect equal outcomes if we're not putting in equal inputs. And that's what unfortunately happens in so many instances. And, we can dig into, why that is the case. Certainly a lot of schools are funded based on property taxes in their local community, and wealthier homes have more revenue to generate from property taxes. And that happens in many states still across the country. And so of course they're going to have more resources to pour into their communities. It's ironic because they're the kids who are probably already going to be okay because their parents have resources to do a lot more for their kids, but they're still getting additional advantages based on how we fund schools in many states.
Yeah, you've shared that, in the Expectations Project, that you're passionate wonks when it comes to numbers, data, case studies, and models. Why is it so important to the Expectations Project, and how does this help you when even advocating?
Yeah, I think we can, a lot of times when we talk about advocacy and equity issues, we can rely more on our passion and our emotion, which is all important. Like, I think you should have that for the issues, that you care about. But we also know that, one, we want to advocate for things that we know are going to actually change the outcomes for kids and for families and communities. And there may be something that I think is just the best thing ever. It's good example, which is, I almost hate to bring it up, but there have been a lot of people over the years pushing, we have to reduce the class sizes for kids. And I think it's just intuitive, right? It feels like, well, if there's fewer kids, my kid gets more attention. So California did this wholesale, like probably 15 years ago, and like they made that their big thing. And they found no change in outcomes with kids after 5 or 10 years of doing that. The reason being, of course, that you can reduce the class size, but if the teacher isn't, well trained and isn't able to deliver effective teaching, it didn't matter, right? It may have felt better, but it didn't actually change the outcomes. And so it's little things like that that are big things that we like to look at policies from a data perspective, so we can see, okay, yes, if we want to reduce class sizes, and we need to do in conjunction with that, improve teacher training and support so they can actually be effective with the smaller class sizes. And so for us, I think it's important to root everything that we advocate for in research, because otherwise it could be just a feel-good feeling of what we want to do, and we're going to spend a lot of time and not see the results that we want.
You also mentioned 6 difference makers for students. You talk about early childhood education, high standards and expectations, quality teachers and leadership, access to quality schools, trauma-informed schools, and racial justice. Can you elaborate a little bit on these 6 items?
Yeah. So early childhood education is so key. We know from tons of research that students' brain development is at its highest between birth to 5 years old. And so that's when I'm not a neuro, biologist or whatever, but that's when all the synapses are all coming together. And it's just a crucial time for our little ones. And in so many places, cities and states, preschool is left to be something that parents have to pay for on their own, which again, if you have lots of money, you can send, I live in the DC area, and preschool can run up to $20,000 a year for preschool at the really, really great private preschools. And that for most families is just not an option. And so then you wonder okay, well, what's left? We have Head Start in some places, a lot of churches have, daycares, which is great. It keeps the baby safe, but daycare doesn't really focus as much on educating and getting them ready for kindergarten in a fun, age-appropriate way. So that's the reason we focus on that. It's just a building block for kids. So a couple of other things that we focus on. So the trauma-informed schools piece, we have focused on that in the last probably 5 years or so, in part because I think some of the other things we'd focused on were very much like academics only, which again is important, but I think we all know, and are seeing more and more with everything else going on in the world, that there are a lot of other things that impact kids outside of the classroom. And especially for kids on the margins, for Black and brown kids, we didn't feel like we could honestly do this work and see the type of change we want to if we didn't incorporate that into the way we think about the work. And so that allows us to look at issues of, disparity in school discipline. Are Black and brown kids getting expelled and suspended more? If so, why? And a lot of the why connects to perhaps trauma issues that they may have experienced that present themselves as behavioral problems. But really what the student needs is counseling, social services support, things like that. So we look to try to expand the funding and the opportunity for families to have connections to those resources in their schools. The other issues are probably a bit more straightforward. High quality teachers, access to quality schools are fairly straightforward. The last one I'll touch on though is this racial justice component. And we added that explicitly because honestly, every policy that we tackle has a racial justice component to it. And we disaggregate all the data by race and by class, but we found that people have been historically more comfortable talking about school inequality in terms of family income, right, and poverty, because it just, it's the post-racial Obama world, all of that.
Right.
And that's just not true, right? So institutional racism still really does permeate a lot of the things that we see happening in our schools. Doesn't mean poverty isn't part of that, it is. But if we just try to isolate racial justice and kind of remove it explicitly from the equation, we felt like we weren't getting to the heart of the matter. And honestly, as Christians, we work with a lot of Christians in particular, since we engage faith communities, we have to force ourselves to have that reckoning ourselves too. And we don't want to sort of sweep those issues under the rug and sort of give the trite answer of like, well, God doesn't see color, so neither should I. And it's like, well, that actually doesn't account for the fact that in Black and brown and some Native populations and some segments of Asian American communities are succeeding at less rate than like white and like other Asian American communities. So there's something going on, like either that or you believe that the rest of us are just dumb and like only white and like Chinese American and Korean American kids are smart. Like what God would design a system like that and design a human race that way? It just isn't logical. So yeah.
Yeah. And it's interesting that you point on that, because even that statement alone, when people try to make that where God doesn't see color, is just theologically incorrect. There's several different ethnicities that John talks about. He sees every nation, every ethnicity worshiping together. And so that's good that you highlighted that point, that it is important. So
yeah. I can only imagine the, either success stories or improvements that you've seen, with the Expectation Project being implemented through communities and, through churches partnering up as well. But what has been one of the most rewarding things for you in regards to the Expectations Project? And then what has been maybe some of the biggest challenges as well that you faced in this journey?
Oh, gosh. I'd say one of the biggest rewards has been, I'll give two. One, we worked on a long-term organizing and advocacy effort in Indianapolis and Indiana a few years ago. And the issue was that Indiana was one of those states that didn't have funding for preschool. And so if a family couldn't afford preschool, they sort of got what they got, like I was mentioning earlier. And so we spent probably about a year doing a lot of organizing with congregations, educating folks, getting our clergy, particularly Black and Latino clergy, on the radio to talk about why it mattered from a faith perspective. Met with the governor, met with the secretary, the head of the education department, and had people emailing and calling. And so there were a couple of other organizations involved with it too. It wasn't just us, but we did see the state of Indiana pass the first piece of legislation ever to give funding for low-income families to access preschool. Wow. And so it was a huge, huge win for kids and families. but
Mm-hmm.
also great for our pastors who had worked with us to see like, oh, right, we'd been tutoring kids to get them ready for kindergarten, which is great, tutor 20 kids a year, but we just were able to get access for thousands of kids to go to preschool and good preschools, right? This program really definitely only allowed families to use this money for a set of preschools that were predetermined to be excellent. So to sort of get the quality piece there. And it was just, things like that, like it's what we live for as an organization. So that's one. The other one would be, I think in the last year or so, we've just seen such growth with our online advocacy, which was perfectly timed pre-COVID. We had already made that switch to really push that because that's just kind of the way the world is now. Like as much as I would love for us all to like march like, Dr. King did, like people just don't do that as much anymore, right? You see it from now and then people will, rise up to the streets. But to keep the ongoing work going, you can really make a lot of change by organizing people online to make phone calls, emails, tweet at, DM their elected
Yeah.
officials. And it really does change things, especially at the local and state level. So we've grown our national constituent list from about 8,000 people about 2 years ago to close to 50,000 now.
Wow, that's
And
awesome.
it's awesome. And we now can say happily we have, and I'm totally grateful to God for this, we have the largest network of faith motivated education and equity
Come on.
advocates in the country.
That's
And
awesome.
like, yeah, man, right? Like, thank God, right? Like that's just, it's such a blessing and such an honor to be able to continue to grow that network and activate these people. And they're very involved in taking action all over the country. And so we saw a couple of national petitions that we did that got, over 25,000 signatures, got us a couple meetings with our clergy with the current Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, to really have her listen to other voices of faith that have a different perspective, and which I think is important, right? Like we share a common faith, like we should be able to have that conversation with her and any leader, quite frankly, but definitely with someone like Secretary DeVos, who leads with her faith. And so it gave us opportunities to try to push on that as well. In terms of challenges, I would say probably the biggest challenge has been kind of coming to the realization that there are lots of folks that are probably not going to fully get on board with our work. And I'm not naive to think that every like Christian in America is going to want to do this. But I think I've realized over the last, I'd say last 4 years, that there are people that I thought would perhaps come our way over time. And I think that divide has gotten worse, particularly with respect to looking at race issues in education and systemic and institutionalized racism. Like there's been such a fair amount of backlash against that in some segments of the church in the last 4 years. And that has been really sad to me. And I had to grieve that, honestly, and realize like, oh, we really don't see this the same way. And, I'm grateful that there's so many people who do, or at least want to learn and explore perhaps seeing things differently. But that was for me just kind of a, wow, okay, like you got to really let some of this go. And, yeah, that's been hard, but
Yeah.
Yeah.
Dr. Nicole, why do you think that is though? I know it's probably layered with so many reasons, but why do you think that is, that there's just is apathy when it comes to that?
It's such a good question. I think it's interesting because some of the same Christians that don't want to talk about equity issues from a racial lens in America are often the same ones that are giving money to other countries, right? So it's particularly like there are a lot of Christians that give charity work to Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, which we are grateful, like by all means, like bless as many people as you can. But when we talk about the inequalities there, it's almost like it's easier for people to talk about that because it's sort of like, oh, it's this developing country. They've got, issues. Like, of course, it's a struggle over there. But when you start to turn the light on your own country and, a community maybe 20 minutes away from you, and you start to acknowledge like, oh, there's real inequality there. Some of it is historical. Some of it is systemic. And some of it I have benefited from, like as a white person, right? Just to be blunt. And I think that is hard for all of us to acknowledge the ways in which we thought we were just working really hard and that's how we got what we got. But it's like, no, you had a leg up.
Mm.
Whether or not you were privileged yourself, like even if you come from like a poor background and you're not a person of color, I don't even like to use the word privilege as much as benefit of the doubt, right? Like
Mhm.
there are ways in which you will get a benefit of the doubt
Yeah.
for a home loan, for walking down the street and not being thought of as a criminal, for maybe assumptions being made about your level of intellectual capacity that often people of color, Black and brown kids, and the rest of us don't necessarily get that benefit of the doubt, right? And I think that's just
Mhm.
uncomfortable and hard for a lot of people to acknowledge. So to me, that's the root of it.
Yeah.
And it's comfortable. Like if your race has been in charge and for a few hundred years, like there's got to be some level of comfort that you get with that, right? That's hard
Mm.
to unpack.
Wow. Your studies have also shown that there are over 300 places of worship across America, around 50,000 high school, poverty public schools struggling.
Hmm.
So that's a ratio of 6 to 1. What
Hmm.
does hope in action look like for a congregation? If there's a pastor right now that's listening to this or a church member, what does that look like for them?
Yeah, there are so many, tens of thousands of congregations, and we do outnumber the high need public schools. Like you said, a ratio of 6 to 1. And so we encourage people, one, to start to educate themselves on the issues, right? So there are not, if you're unaware, certainly,
Mhm.
read the book that I've written. There's a ton of other good resources out there. I think our website still has some of those listed. We may have updated it recently, but to educate yourself about the scope of the issues, and then to figure out two things. One, is my congregation more inclined to do kind of work right now, meaning like some type of partnership? And I'll come back to that with a public school. Or do we want to learn more about how to do advocacy, which for some people is like a bigger stretch, and it may not be everyone's jam, as I like to say, like it's not for everybody. But we believe we need both, right? We believe
Mm.
that congregations, absolutely, if you feel compelled to reach out to a public school and just simply ask them, like, we want to be helpful, what do you need, with no agenda, and do what they ask, right? Don't come and say, we want to help teach the parents how to be better parents. It's like, did they ask you to do that? Like, no, pastor, they didn't. They said, can you come and help tutor our kids in reading? Go help tutor their kids in reading,
Yeah. Yeah.
But to take that approach of just coming in humble, being willing to do whatever they're asked to do, whatever we're asked to do. But the other thing is, we don't think that tutoring or giving backpack supplies, both of which are needed, are going to help solve the massive inequalities that we see. So we think
Mhm.
we are going to need to lift our voices, speak truth to power, and force our elected officials. And I say force, don't be scared, y'all. I don't mean like, they don't have to be scary,
Absolutely.
but speak firmly and
Mhm.
hold our elected officials accountable for saying, like, no, actually, this particular policy isn't allowing any low-income families in our city to go to preschool. Like, we've got to shift the funding and provide for all families, because they're not getting a fair start, and it's not right. Like, we're handicapping and like hindering kids from the age of 3. Like, that's not a godly system. And so things like that, right? Really pushing to get those changes, I think, are two things that I would recommend.
Yeah. I know in some of our previous conversations, we've talked about how, churches and even believers sometimes are very well versed in compassion work, right?
Yeah.
But there's sometimes a lack of advocacy. You know,
Hmm.
it's one thing for me to give every single week, you know what I mean? Like, hey, here's your supplies, here's your food, here's
Yeah.
this that you need. When am I going to ask the question, why do you always keep coming back?
Yes, my
You
sister.
know?
That's exactly the
Mhm.
question.
Yes,
Yep.
and
Yep.
that's what there's power when both, like, compassion and justice come together. Like,
Absolutely.
there's a different thing. So I don't know if you want to share maybe if, stories that of churches that have actually taken both and, the
Hmm.
impact that they've actually, had in their own churches or local schools.
Yeah, there's a church in Indianapolis, where the pastor and his wife, amazing congregation. They are in their congregation is located in an area that is lower income, African American pastor, and they had a partnership with the public schools, and they kind of had the same approach I mentioned, like, what do you need? And the school was like, well, we've got all these kids that are basically, I forget the name they had for them. It was something like, sadly, kind of pejorative, but who are struggling, right? And they said, well, we can't do anything with these kids. What can you do? And so they started an after-school program for the kids. And because it was at a church, parents had to, sign permission to let their child go to a church to have this. And, it's after school. It's totally legal. And what they did, though, is that they brought in counseling and sort of support, right? So hired counselors who were trained counselors to work with kids. They also got funding to hire retired teachers to tutor kids, which is another level than like, hey, y'all, like, come and read to a kid, right? Because, like, I mean, let's just be real. Like, it's hard to do. And, like, a retired teacher is going to be better at it, right? And, being able to deal with the socio and emotional needs. And so what happened was the schools were coming to this church, this pastor saying, like, what are you all doing? Like, these kids have gone from being like the worst behaved kids to like lowest academically to like being in the top 25%, right?
Wow.
And it became this amazing story. And so what happened, though, is that they ended up advocating for funding for that type of program to be replicated across the school district. And they got a significant amount of funding. And so other churches were able to apply it. And this was a few years ago, so I haven't kept up with them as much because we're not doing as much work there now. But it was just amazing to see them taking their approach and wanting to like do it, like take it to scale. And they ended up having conversations with people at the state level who were trying to understand, like, what are the ways in which you've been able to make this change happen? How can we even broaden the lessons learned from this? And they were advocating for, like, you need counselors in schools, right? I mean, so they were able to really push schools, whether or not they adopted this program, to take some of the lessons that they had learned from it. And it was pretty cool.
Wow, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Are there any final thoughts or comments that you would like to share?
I just think education is one of these things that we all know that this matters so much that we have to get this right. It's just easy for it to be at the bottom of everyone's list of issues they care most about because, kids go to school for 12 years, kindergarten to senior year, hopefully. So we feel like we have time to get it right. And it doesn't feel always as the most urgent thing. I will say, like, as hard as the COVID pandemic has been, it has definitely made a lot of us realize how important schools are and just what happens when kids can't go, the implications for parents, obviously, who have to somehow learn to teach their kids at home while they Zoom or whatever, is ridiculous, obviously, and incredibly hard to do as a parent, but obviously we're doing it for safety reasons, and I support that 100%. But I think we also have been able to see just the inequalities that exist. I've been surprised at how many people were surprised that there are millions of kids who didn't have computers or who didn't have high-speed internet, or, we lost touch with millions of kids or just say tens of thousands of kids in some school districts because once COVID hit, like, there was no way to reach them anymore, right? Like, they just kind of disappeared off the radar screen. And we should all be horrified by all of those things and fix it. And so I'm hoping that at least for this season, maybe we can keep this on people's radar screen as more of a sense of urgency is my prayer.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Nicole. This has honestly been a blessing.
You guys are so great.
I know our listeners, they're going to be enriched by this conversation. So thank you so much for your time.
Of course. Thank you all so much. It's always good to see you. Take care.
Take care. Bye.
What an amazing conversation we had with Dr. Nicole Baker. Really enjoyed our time together that we had. Learned a lot. I hope that you all were informed and that you also gained something from this conversation.
Yes, absolutely. Please check out her webpage, Expectations Project, and get involved. Get involved in your church, in your community. We all have a part to play to bring advocacy and awareness to this as well.
And in the description, we'll go ahead and leave you all with the resources that you heard on today's episode, her 2 books, as well as her website, so you can check that out. So hope you were blessed. Take care. God bless.
And much love.